I would like now to introduce our first speaker, Professor David Powers from Cornell University, where he has been teaching for the past 42 years. And his research focuses on the Prophet Muhammad, on the Quran, on the rise of Islam, and on the history of Islamic law and its application in Muslim societies. He is the author of numerous books, including The Formation of Islamic Law of Inheritance. He has been the editor of Islamic Law and Society since 1994, and he is also the author of Law, Society, and Culture in the Maghrib, and Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, the making of the last prophet, and also a book about Zeid, published in 2014. Professor Powers, please.
Thank you very much, Yohanan. Thank you for the kind invitation to participate. It's a pleasure to be back in Jerusalem, especially pleasure to be because I was a student here back in 1973, and after that, Yohanan was my teacher in what they called Easy Arabic, I believe, at that time, and Eitan Kohlberg introduced me to the Quran in a seminar, pro-seminar on Quran and Tafsir, and then there was Professor Kister, and I remember taking a seminar with him on Muhammad, on the biography of Muhammad, and after a long day, he asked me to open Watt's Muhammad at Mecca and to read the preface. And as I remember in the preface, Watt says that he has attempted to write a biography of Muhammad that will meet the highest standards of Western scholarship and that also will be acceptable to Muslims. And Professor Kister looked at me and he said, "Is that possible?" And that was the end of the lesson. And that lesson has stuck with me for the rest of my life, which is, and as will come out perhaps in what I have to say here this morning. And what I'm going to say, this is a revised version of whatever I posted a month or so ago, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's too long. And let's see how this works. All right, and the end is speculative, and I invite any and all resistance that you want to throw at me. So, at the turn of the 7th century CE, prophecy had been in abeyance for nearly half a millennium, and Jews, Christians, and other monotheists were anticipating the appearance of a new prophet. According to Islamic sources, God resumed contact with believers in 610 CE by sending a series of revelations to an Arab tribesman, a man named Muhammad, who, over the next 23 years, shared these revelations with members of his family, with fellow tribesmen and others. Following the conquest of the Levant and the rise of the Umayyad dynasty, Islamic sources begin to assert that Muhammad was not merely another prophet, but rather the last prophet. This assertion is based in part upon a single Quranic witness, verse 40 of Surah Al-Ahzab. Muhammad was not the father of any of your men, but the messenger of God and the seal of prophets. Although the meaning of seal of prophets, Khatam an-Nabiyyin, the meaning of the metaphor was contested within the early community of believers, by the turn of the 2nd century AH, it was widely understood as signifying that Muhammad was the last prophet. Early Quran commentators linked the revelation of verse 40 with a domestic crisis within the household of the prophet involving Muhammad, his adopted son Zeid, and the latter's wife. It took considerable time, between 50 and 100 years by my estimate, before Muslim storytellers, commentators, and traditionists were able to put this story together. What follows is a summary of the story as it had emerged by the middle of the 2nd century Hijri. Sometime between 605 and 610, Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Qurashi, who had not yet received his first revelation, acquired a slave named Zaid ibn Haritha, who was approximately 20 years old. Soon thereafter, Muhammad manumitted Zaid and adopted him as his son in a ceremony that took place near the Kaaba. The adoption had 2 legal consequences. Zaid was now Zaid ibn Muhammad, or he was known as Zaid ibn Muhammad, and mutual rights of inheritance were created between father and son. According to one source, Zaid was the first person to become a Muslim, awwal man aslama, and he was known as Hib Rasulullah. Clearly, he was a person of high status within the early community of believers. In Mecca, Zaid married a woman named Ayman, who gave birth to a son named Usama. Shortly after the Hijrah to Medina, Zaid expressed interest in taking a second wife, one of Muhammad's cousins, a beautiful woman named Zainab bint Jahsh. Initially, Muhammad was reluctant to arrange the marriage, but he eventually agreed, and he instructed Zainab to marry Zaid. When the marriage proposal was presented to Zainab, she found it repugnant. Zaid was a former slave, whereas she was a noble Qurashi woman. In her own words, she said of herself that she was min atam nisa Quraysh. I'm not quite sure how to translate that. To resolve the impasse, God intervened in history by sending down a revelation in which he declared that no believer, male or female, has any choice in a matter after God and his messenger have issued a command about it. This revelation would become verse 36 of Surah Al-Ahzab. The marriage between Zaid and Zainab was not a happy one. Zainab may have been beautiful, but she had a sharp tongue, and she nagged her husband incessantly. Zaid now told his father that he wanted to divorce Zainab. Muhammad had a better idea. Intending to repair relations between husband and wife, he paid a visit to the couple. Inadvertently, he caught a glimpse of the woman as she was in the act of rising to her feet. Absaraha qa'imatan. Some of you might think of Bathsheba, or Rochetzet. And he immediately fell in love with her. Now, the prophet apparently knew that it was forbidden to have sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, and he therefore concealed his feelings for the woman. To solve this dilemma, Muhammad annulled his adoption of Zaid. Lastu bi abika. I am not your father, he was reported to have said. The dutiful and loyal son accepted the prophet's decision without complaint, freely and willingly giving up his status as Muhammad's son and as Muhammad's heir. In hindsight, I would say this is a very bad decision on his part. Zaid now divorced Zainab, whereupon the prophet married her. Remember, this is all as the story as it crystallized 150 years after. The marriage between Muhammad and Zainab was a matter of public knowledge. Tongues wagged. Apparently, certain people, identified in the Qur'an only as Anas, accused Muhammad of committing a sin. Incest by marrying a woman who had been his daughter-in-law. Islamic sources identify these people as either Muslims or Jews or hypocrites. In response to this accusation, God intervened in history, again, by sending down a revelation in which he announced that he himself had given this woman in marriage to the prophet. Zawajnakaha. To create a legal justification for the marriage, God introduced a distinction, put on his lawyer's cap, he introduced a distinction between marriage to the former wife of a biological son, which had been and continued to be prohibited, and marriage to the former wife of an adopted son, which henceforth was permissible. This revelation became verse 37 of Surah Al-Ahzab. The new revelation only complicated matters, raising questions about the Jāhiliyya, a word which I might want to come back to, but the Jāhiliyya institution of adoption. Was it fitting and proper for a man to incorporate within his family a male or female who was not related to him by ties of blood, and to give the child his name and the right to inherit from him? Apparently not, or apparently no longer. And so, the freshly minted distinction that God had made between biological sons and adopted sons in verse 37 became the proverbial distinction without a difference. Once again, God intervened in history, this time by sending down a revelation in which he abolished the institution of adoption as it had been practiced at that time. Call them after their true fathers, the revelation states, warning that any believer who refers to a man as the son of someone other than his true biological father commits a sin. This revelation became verse 5 of Surah Al-Ahzab. The two revelations that would become verses 5 and 37 of Surah Al-Ahzab were in apparent conflict with one another. According to verse 37, Zeid was in fact Muhammad's da'i, or adopted son, and a man who was favored by both God and his prophet. But according to verse 5, the institution of adoption had been abolished. This is no longer the Muslim commentators but me. What was the problem? Recall that Zeid had been approximately 20 years old when he was adopted by Muhammad. That is to say, he was a rajul, or a man. And recall also that Zeid had been the prophet's adopted son for approximately 20 years. And finally, that Zeid had a son named Usama, who was the prophet's grandson. This was Usama ibn Zeid ibn Muhammad, the beloved son of the beloved of the messenger of God. Now, if Muhammad had a son or a grandson who attained physical maturity and outlived his father, one might argue, as some believers I think did, that the office of prophecy would continue through this lineal descent group. Muhammad, Zeid ibn Muhammad, Usama ibn Zeid ibn Muhammad. With regard to Zeid, the question was moot. In 8 AH, Muhammad appointed him as the commander of a military expedition that was sent to southern Jordan, where he fell as a martyr in the village of Mu'tah. But Zeid was survived by his son Usama, who was approximately 18 years old at the time of Muhammad's death in 632. Would the office of prophecy have passed to Zeid if he had outlived the prophet? Which is in fact what Muqatil says would have happened. Muqatil ibn Sulaiman says around the year 150 that that would have happened. In Baqiya Zeid lakana nabiyan. Would the office of prophecy have passed to Zeid if he outlived the prophet? If the answer to this question is yes, did the office of prophecy pass from Zeid to his son Usama, because it goes through males? To answer these two questions, God now intervened in history yet again. I'm coming back to this traditional story, sending down the revelation that would become verse 40 of Surah Al-Ahzab, referring to Muhammad by name, and in the past tense, the verse proclaims, مَا كَانَ مُحَمَّدٌ أَبَا أَحَدٍ مِّن رِجَالِكُمْ. Muhammad was not the father of any of your men. Adding, in my view, seemingly for good measure, because it just seems, that he was the messenger of God and the seal of prophets. Rasulullah wa khatam an-nabiyyin. According to the emerging Islamic narrative, God intervened in history on 4 separate occasions, 3 of them in rapid succession, in order to direct the course of events in such a manner as to make it clear that Muhammad brought the office of prophecy to an end. From a theological perspective, the Islamic narrative makes perfect sense. After all, as the Qur'an indicates, sacred history is subject to God's control by means of sunnat Allah, roughly divine providence. But does the Islamic narrative satisfy the demands of historical investigation? Back to Watt and Kister into that seminar back in 1973. Is it plausible that a key doctrine, like the finality of prophecy, a doctrine that establishes a hegemonic relationship between Muslims on the one hand and Jews and Christians on the other, was triggered by a domestic scandal within Muhammad's household? And to answer this question, what I do in the written version of the paper is to turn first to non-Islamic sources that mention the episode, and then to the earliest Islamic sources. Well, should I try? I don't know how much time I have.
You have plenty of time.
Okay. Shukran. All right. So let me turn now to early Islamic sources. The majority of the inhabitants of the Levant following the Arab conquests were Christians, some of whom expressed interest in and had something to say about the Prophet's marriage to a woman, they don't know her name, who previously had been married to someone named Zeid. Around the turn of the first Islamic century, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III is said to have engaged in a correspondence with the Umayyad Caliph Omar ibn Abdulaziz. In one letter, Leo accuses Muhammad of sinning by marrying a divorcee, a claim that flies in the face of Christian biblical doctrine, which emphasizes the permanence of marriage. Omar, and it's clearly written from a Christian perspective, Omar accepts the emperor's accusation but defends the prophet by invoking the example of the biblical David. He says to Leo, "You rebuke us because our prophet married a woman whom her husband had repudiated. It is indeed what David did in the case of Uriah and his wife." To this, the emperor responds, "As for the example of David, who took Uriah's wife, as you remind me, it's well known that therein he committed a sin before the Eternal, for which he was grievously punished." Leo proceeds to condemn the artifice used by the prophet to seduce this woman, criticizes Muhammad as unchaste, expresses repugnance at the assertion that God would intervene in history to satisfy the sexual desires of one of his prophets, and characterizes a new rule introduced by Omar's co-religionists as a disgusting law. The emperor continues, "It had been my intention to conceal," highlighting certain words, "it had been my intention to conceal, if possible, the shamelessness with which you remarry, and how, before retaking your repudiated wives, you make them sleep in the bed of another." The shameless practice that Leo had in mind, a practice that he would have preferred to conceal, is what treated in verse 230 of Surah Al-Baqarah, according to which it is not a sin for a man to remarry his wife after divorcing her on the condition that the parties adhere to a special procedure. The divorcee, the woman, must marry another man who, after consummating the marriage, pronounces a triple talaq. Following the second divorce, the original husband is free to remarry his first wife. This procedure is known as tahlil. And the second husband, who makes the woman licit to her first husband, is known as the muhallil. Leo III clearly found this procedure repugnant, as did some Muslims, including Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was reported to have said, "May God curse the muhallil as well as the one who initiates a tahlil marriage." So Christians accuse Muhammad of sinning by marrying a divorcee, and they link this episode to tahlil in the Quran. Let me move to John of Damascus. In the last chapter of On Heresies, John of Damascus relates two versions of a story about Muhammad's marriage to the former wife of a man whom he identifies only as Zaid. Both versions tell the same story, albeit with differing levels of detail. According to version 1, Muhammad fell in love with the beautiful wife of a man named Zaid, who was one of his comrades, presumably a companion. Subsequently, when Muhammad and Zaid were sitting together, and that's an important motif, at an undisclosed location, Muhammad informed his comrade that God had commanded him to take his wife, that is, to marry her. Zaid responded by acknowledging Muhammad's status as an apostle and declaring his willingness to relinquish his beautiful wife. "Take my wife," he offered, demonstrating his loyalty to Muhammad and perhaps his obedience to God. Version 2, which is longer, specifies that Zaid did in fact divorce his wife in compliance with a divine command. A few days later, Muhammad received a second divine command instructing him to marry the divorcee. He complied. By marrying a divorcee, John declares, Muhammad committed the sin of adultery, same as in Leo. In version 2, Muhammad responds to the charge of adultery by introducing a new law regulating remarriage after divorce, to wit, the tahlil procedure that I've just referred to. In neither version 1 nor version 2 of John of Damascus do we find any reference to a muhallil, or intermediary husband. This gap is filled in a variant preserved by the Christian theologian Arethas, 10th century, in which Muhammad informs his friend, again presumably a companion, that his wife had committed adultery. Upon receiving this information, Muhammad's friend threatened to kill his wife. In an apparent effort to save the woman's life, Muhammad instructed his friend to divorce his wife so that another man might marry her and restore her purity. When his friend divorced his wife, Muhammad, quote, defiled her and satisfied his desires, unquote, and then instructed his friend to remarry the woman. In this version of the story, Muhammad is portrayed as taking advantage of the Quranic tahlil procedure to satisfy his sexual desire for his friend's wife. Again, the prophet commits a sin, here adultery, by marrying a divorcee. Both Leo III and John of Damascus were familiar with the domestic crisis involving Muhammad, Zaid, and Zaid's wife. According to John, Muhammad and Zaid were sitting together when Muhammad informed his friend that God had commanded him to marry Zainab. Both Leo III and John responded with disgust to the association of sexual desire with the prophet. Both accused Muhammad of committing the sin of adultery by marrying a divorcee. Both knew that God resolved the crisis by sending down a revelation, and both identified this revelation as verse 230 of Surah Al-Baqarah, which introduces the tahlil procedure. Conversely, neither Leo nor John mentions that Zaid was Muhammad's adopted son, and neither mentions the name of Zaid's wife, and neither refers to Muhammad as Khatam an-Nabiyyin. Let me now turn to early Islamic sources. Verse 37 of Surah Al-Ahzab introduced a new rule that modified existing marriage taboos and uniquely, I think, provides the sabab or occasion for the introduction of this rule. Go take a look at verse 37 if you're not familiar with it, to see how it's giving you detail that one finds nowhere else in the Quran about the background for the revelation of a particular verse. This sabab was a domestic crisis within the household of Muhammad. But the verse leaves many questions unanswered. What was the name of Zaid's father? Zaid is the Quran mentions Zaid, just Zaid. What was the name of his wife? What were the circumstances of Zaid's marriage to this woman? What were the circumstances of Muhammad's marriage to this woman? Who accused Muhammad of committing a sin? How could Muhammad have an adopted son and yet not be the father of any of your men? And what verse or verses were revealed in connection with different moments of this episode? Over time, and it took time, and over time, Muslim authorities and exegetes responded to these and other questions. The earliest sources manifest significant either ignorance or confusion. The following report is attributed to Urwa ibn az-Zubayr. Muhammad said to a woman named Kulthum bint Uqba, "Marry Zaid ibn Haritha, for he is a good man for you." But she found the Prophet's proposal repugnant. Karihat laha. Therefore, God revealed, and he sent down the verse, which becomes verse 36 of Surah Al-Ahzab. Here, Zaid is identified as the son of Haritha, perhaps for the first time, and the woman whom the Prophet wanted him to marry is identified as Kulthum bint Uqba, daughter of the Umayyad chief Uqba ibn Rabi'ah, and uterine sister of Uthman ibn Affan. As a woman of high status, Kulthum would have been an attractive marriage candidate. Once again, we encounter the repugnancy trope, albeit with a twist. Whereas in the exchange between Leo III and Umar II, it was the emperor who responded with repugnance to Muhammad's reliance on divine revelation to satisfy his sexual desires. In Urwa's report, it was the woman whom the Prophet instructed to marry Zaid who responded with repugnance to the marriage proposal. Be that as it may, God resolved the impasse by sending down the revelation that would become verse 36 now, and that's important, verse 36 of Surah Al-Ahzab, which teaches that no believer, male or female, has any choice in a matter once God and his prophet have issued a command. Approximately one generation later, Mujahid ibn Jabr identified the woman who was married to Zaid as Zainab bint Jahsh, Muhammad's paternal cross cousin. Zainab's mother, Umayma, and Muhammad's father, Abdullah, were sister and brother. Both Zainab and Muhammad were grandchildren of Abd al-Muttalib. As a woman of high status, Zainab would have been an attractive marriage candidate. According to Mujahid, it was Zainab, not Kulthum, whom the Prophet instructed to marry Zaid. Like Kulthum, Zainab found the proposal repugnant. Again, God resolved the impasse by sending down a revelation. According to Mujahid, the revelation that was sent down was verse 28.
Recording in progress.
Thank you. Of Surah Al-Ahzab. Verse 28, which reads, "O Prophet, say to your wives, if you want the life of this world and its ornament, come, I shall make provision for you and release you fairly." Note that in verse 28, the narrator instructs the Prophet to make a statement to his wives. At the moment on which this verse reportedly was revealed, Zainab was not yet one of the Prophet's wives. Several years would pass before she did become his wife. The connection between verse 28 and Zainab was not a good fit. By the turn of the 1st century AH, Muslim authorities had identified Zeid as the son of a man named Haritha. They had also identified his wife as either Kulthum bint Uqba or Zainab bint Jahsh. Both were women of high status. Kulthum was an Umayyad, Zainab was a Hashimi. As for the verse that was revealed about this woman's marriage to Zeid, it was either verse 36 of the surah, if she was Kulthum, or it was verses 28 through 29, if she was Zainab. The double discrepancy, one, the identity of the woman who found the idea of marrying Zeid repugnant, and two, the verse that was revealed on that occasion, was eliminated between the years 100 and 150 AH. Beginning around the middle of the 2nd century, Kulthum bint Uqba disappears from narratives about the revelation of both of these verses, and at the same time, the story about a woman who reacted with repugnance to a prophetic instruction that she marry Zeid was detached from verses 28 through 29 of Surah Al-Ahzab and attached to verse 36 of that surah. Henceforth, the sources are unanimous. The woman was Zainab bint Jahsh. Arguably, the first complete version of the narrative is found in Muqatil ibn Sulayman's commentary on verse 36 of Surah Al-Ahzab. And I won't read it, it's in the paper. But I'll just say, in this narrative, which I didn't read, we encounter the repugnancy motif, albeit with yet another twist. According to Muqatil, it was not Zainab who expressed repugnance at the Prophet's proposal that she marry Zeid, but her brother, Abdullah, who, in the absence of her father, was serving as her marriage guardian. Abdullah was reluctant to give his sister in marriage to an Arabi who had been purchased by Muhammad as a slave during the Jāhiliyya, even if he was Muhammad's son by adoption and heir. As for Zainab, she protested that it would be inappropriate for her, a noble Qurayshi woman, to marry a Mawla. This was the son of the Prophet, not a Mawla. The impasse was resolved by the revelation of the verse that would become verse 36. Zeid married Zainab, and as noted, the marriage was short-lived. Let's move ahead several years to the circumstances surrounding the marriage between Muhammad and Zainab. This report is attributed to Ash-Sha'bi. When Zeid ibn Haritha fell ill, the messenger of God went to him in order to pay a visit. Upon his arrival, Zainab bint Jahsh, Zeid's wife, was sitting next to Zeid. When Zainab stood up to attend to a certain matter, the messenger of God, Nazara ilayha, lowered his head and exclaimed, Alhamdulillah, musarrif al-qulub. Praise be to God who has the power to transform a man's heart on a dime. In response, Zeid said, I will divorce her for your sake, O messenger of God. He replied, no. Then God revealed the verse that would become verse 37 of Surah Al-Ahzab. This report appears to be based on the testimony of eyewitnesses who were present during the episode and who heard and committed to memory statements made by Muhammad and Zeid on that occasion. If so, the eyewitnesses are nowhere identified. One wonders if Ash-Sha'bi may have been familiar with John of Damascus, or if Ash-Sha'bi and John of Damascus were drawing on a common pool of stories. Be that as it may, Ash-Sha'bi knows that the episode took place in Zeid's residence, wherever that may have been. Apparently, Zeid had fallen ill and the Prophet paid a sick visit to his adopted son. The three key figures, Muhammad, Zeid, and Zainab, were all sitting together. When Zainab arose to attend to an unspecified matter, Muhammad's gaze fell upon the woman and he immediately experienced sexual desire for her, causing to praise God for his ability to transform a man's heart instantaneously. All right, and the summary. Clearly, I would argue, we are dealing with two versions of the same story. One Christian, that we find in John of Damascus and Leo, and the other Islamic, albeit with differences. And what I'm trying not to do here, I'm trying not to privilege the Islamic version of the story. That's the whole trick here. I'm trying to suggest that we should pay close attention to the Christian version of the story. In both the Christian and the Islamic narrative, the three key figures are sitting together, either at an undisclosed location or at Zeid's residence. According to the Christian version, Muhammad fell in love with Zeid's beautiful wife. According to the Islamic version, Muhammad experienced sexual desire for Zainab after seeing her rise to her feet. In the Christian version, God commands Muhammad to take Zeid's wife. In the Islamic version, Muhammad does not accept Zeid's offer to divorce his wife until God sends down a revelation commanding him to marry the woman. In the Christian version, the revelation that God sends down would become verse 230 of Surah Al-Baqarah, Tahlil, whereas in the Islamic version, it would become verse 37 of Surah Al-Ahzab, which legitimizes a marriage between a man and the former wife of his adopted son. In the Christian version, Muhammad is accused of committing the sin of adultery by marrying a divorcee. In the Islamic version, the accusation of Muhammad is compounded. The woman who he marries is not only a divorcee, but also his daughter-in-law. Now, the primary function of the Christian version of the story, I would argue, is to establish that Muhammad committed a mortal sin and thus was not a true prophet. The Islamic narrative responds to this accusation. What I'm suggesting is that verse 37 of the Quran is responding to an accusation, I'm arguing, by Christians that Muhammad committed a mortal sin and thus was not a true prophet. All right. So, I wrote this yesterday in the airport and last night after I got here. I don't know if it makes any sense, but we'll see. Let me try to give you an alternative explanation, okay, for what I've just been talking about. And this is provisional. And it's complicated, and there's a lot of pieces in the puzzle. But here we go. Still doing okay. 10 more minutes. Plenty of time. Beginning in the fourth, and now I'm interested in its finality, the idea of finality. Beginning in the 4th century of the Common Era, Christian theologians taught that the Roman Empire was a divinely elected polity that was destined to be the last world empire prior to the eschaton. In the 4th century, Lactantius predicted that Constantine would vanquish his imperial colleagues, usher in a new imperium under divine law, and rule as the embodiment of Christ. At the end of the 4th century, the Tiburtine Sibyl refers to the advent of a last emperor who would defeat the enemies of Christianity prior to the second coming of Christ. One finds the same idea in the Syriac Christian Alexander legend, likely composed, according to Tommaso Tassé, during the reign of Justinian. Here, Tuberlac predicts that the Roman Empire will triumph over all kingdoms on earth and will continue to flourish until the eschaton, when Alexander's house will surrender its power to Christ at the second coming. This idea is also mentioned in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, composed in northern Mesopotamia sometime between 644 and 670 of the Common Era, a generation after Muhammad. Here, the author explains that after pushing the Ishmaelites back to Arabia, a king of the Greeks would travel to Jerusalem, where we are now, where he would go up and stand on Golgotha, and the Holy Cross shall be placed on that spot where it had been fixed when it bore Christ. The king of the Greeks shall place his crown on the top of the Holy Cross, stretch out his hands towards heaven, and hand over the kingdom to God the Father. Okay. Who was this king of the Greeks? Well, in 630, which is the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who reigned from 610 to 641, restored the true cross to Jerusalem, and his supporters and propagandists surely regarded him as the last emperor who would unite all Christians in one final imperium that would be the last earthly kingdom prior to the second coming of Christ. And I believe that he and Christian theologians were also trying to unify the Christian world by promoting a theological doctrine called monoenergism, and don't ask me what that means. Of course, Heraclius and Muhammad were contemporaries. In 612 of the Common Era, the emperor announced his intention to marry his young niece, a woman named Martina. the proposed marriage fell within the prohibited degrees of kinship. And the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was promoting this idea of monoenergism, Sergius I, put earnest pressure on Heraclius by letter and admonished him to repudiate his connection with the woman. Eventually, however, the Patriarch relented, and he himself performed the marriage ceremony, placing the royal crown on the bride's head. The marriage was scandalous. Tongues wagged. The populace denounced it as an unlawful deed that is forbidden by Roman custom, and the emperor's favorite faction, the Greens, insulted the emperor and his wife when they appeared in the hippodrome. The sin committed by Heraclius attracted comparisons to the sin committed by David. According to verse 4 of Psalm 51, David said, referring to his marriage to Bathsheba, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me." Following the fall of Antioch to the Arabs in 637, Heraclius' brother Theodosius made the following statement about his brother, the emperor, quote, "His sin is continually before him," alluding to Psalm 51, verse 4. Subsequently, criticism of Heraclius spread to Egypt, where posthumously the emperor was mocked by the masses. As these events were unfolding in Byzantium, the New Believers movement was emerging in the Hejaz, led by a prophet who also sought to unify his people. Following the death of their Arab prophet, the Arabs entered Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, defeated the Byzantines and also the Persians, and took control of the mountain arena. The invaders came to regard themselves as a new nation, or more accurately, a new religio-political community, a new ummah. As one military success followed another, this new ummah surely, or arguably, came to regard, arguably, not surely, came to regard itself as the successors of the Byzantines, and perhaps as the last world empire prior to the eschaton. The association between the new ummah and the eschaton appears in a variant of verse 6 of chapter 61 of the Qur'ān. I don't know the name. Verse 6, attributed, it's well known, attributed to Ubay ibn Ka'b. The verse in both the standard version and in the variant opens in the same way, as follows. "Remember when Jesus, the son of Mary, said, 'O children of Israel.'" Okay, that's the opening of the verse. But in the and it goes in the standard version, Jesus says that, talks about a prophet who will confirm the earlier prophets, and refers to someone named Ahmad who will come along. But in the variant, here's what we read. Jesus says, "I am God's messenger to you, bringing you an announcement of a prophet whose community will be the last community, Akhir al-Umam, and by means of whom Yahtum Allah bihi al-Anbiya wal-Rusul. God seals the messengers and the prophets." Note, in Ubay's codex, the notion of finality qualifies the new community, not its prophet. Akhir al-Umam, not Khatam al-Nabiyyin. This ummah will be Akhir al-Umam, the last community prior to the eschaton. By means of this last community, Yahtum Allah bihi al-Anbiya wal-Rusul. Here the seal metaphor refers to an action performed by God upon earlier messengers and prophets. God seals earlier messengers and prophets. Finally, in Ubay's version of Quran 61:6, there's no reference to Muhammad or to his sonlessness. Now, in what I believe that was the first stage in the development of the Khatam an-Nubuwah theological doctrine, the first evidence we have of development of the doctrine. And then I think we move on to a second stage. Believers began to refer to the prophet himself as Khatam an-Nabiyyin, literally the seal of prophets, or perhaps the last prophet. That is to say, the man who brought the office of prophecy to an end. This claim was contested within the early community of believers, as evidenced, among other things, by a statement attributed to Aisha. And in the statement she says, say, huwa khatim an-nabiyyin, but don't say there's no prophet after him. There will be a prophet after him, but he's still khatim an-nabiyyin. Be that as it may, by the turn of the 2nd century Hijrah, many, but probably not many, I don't know how many, members of the new community of believers had come to regard their prophet as the last prophet. Meanwhile, Christian theologians who became familiar with the new community of believers rejected the believers' claim that Muhammad was a true prophet. To this end, as I've discussed, they put forward the accusation that Muhammad, like Heraclius, committed a mortal sin by marrying a divorcee, the former wife of one of his companions, a man named Zeid. Any man who commits a mortal sin cannot be a true prophet. Note the parallels between Heraclius and Muhammad. Both Heraclius, and I can be accused of parallelomania, but that's okay. Note the parallels. Both Heraclius and Muhammad were accused of committing a sin. Both were criticized by members of their communities, either the populace or Anas. And both marriages eventually received religious sanction, either from the Patriarch of Constantinople or from God. In addition, both men sought to unify their respective communities through religious reform, and both men were associated with the idea of finality. Coincidence? Sunnat Allah? Or perhaps something else? The question is, what is that something else? Be that as it may, the claim that Muhammad was the last prophet logically required his sonlessness. Apparently, however, Muhammad did have a son. It required his sonlessness because the Quran says that prophecy passes from, it's the exclusive possession of Dhurriyyat Ibrahim. It passes from father to son, even if it skips generations. So logically, he had to be sonless in order to qualify as a prophet. Apparently, and here I'm making a concession because I really haven't acknowledged the possibility that Zeid might have been real. But apparently Muhammad did have a son, albeit an adopted son, who lived into adulthood. This son, Zeid, awwal man uslima, and was known as Hib Rasulullah. And Zeid in turn had a son named Usama, who was the Prophet's grandson, known as the beloved son of the beloved of the messenger of God. But if Muhammad was in fact the last prophet, he could not have, or he could not be remembered as having, either a son or a grandson, even by adoption, who bore his name, Zeid ibn Muhammad, Usama ibn Zeid ibn Muhammad. To eliminate this threat to the emerging theological doctrine of a finality, the believers, I'm arguing, after Muhammad had died, formulated a series of new revelations that were designed not only to refute the Christian accusation that Muhammad had committed a sin by marrying a divorcee, but also to secure the emerging doctrine of the finality of prophecy. On the one hand, the believers acknowledged that their prophet had married a divorcee, but he committed no sin. In fact, God himself had authorized the marriage, zawajnakaha. In the Islamic version of the episode, the sin that Muhammad was accused of committing was not marriage to a divorcee, but incest, perhaps more serious. In the Islamic version, the woman married by the Prophet was the former wife of his adopted son, Zeid. Like Heraclius' marriage to Martina, Muhammad's marriage to Zeid's former wife elicited sharp criticism, and in this instance by Anas, according to the Quran, the people. In response to this criticism, a new revelation specified that it is not a sin to marry the former wife of one's adopted son on the condition that the adopted son no longer had any sexual desire for the woman. The true function of the story, and I'm almost done, was to create, I argue, that the true function of the verse 37 of the Quran was to create what I call a narrative space in which Muhammad could sever the father-son relationship with Zeid. Subsequently, storytellers would fill this narrative space by putting the following words into the prophet's mouth. Lastu bi'abika, I'm not your father. Lest there be any question about the relationship between Muhammad and Zeid, another revelation abolished the institution of adoption. These new revelations were inserted into Surah Al-Ahzab, which, according to Islamic sources, was heavily redacted. It is reported that as many as 100 or more verses were removed from the surah. Well, the sources don't tell us which verses, and they don't say that verses were added to the surah, but that would have been the opportunity to do so. After the Quran had been collected, whenever that may have been, the new revelations took their place or were placed at the beginning of verses, at the beginning of this surah and in the center of the surah. The key verse is verse 40. Muhammad was not the father of any of your men, but the messenger of God and the seal of prophets. The verse explicitly links the doctrine of Khatam al-Nubuwwah with Muhammad's sonlessness. The formulation of the opening statement in the past tense, ma kana Muhammad, is, in my opinion, a sign that this revelation was formulated after the fact, after Muhammad's death, by believers who knew that he was sonless, or to be precise, who knew that he had to be sonless in order to qualify as a new prophet. I've got another page, but that's enough, I suppose. And thank you very much.
The complexity of the prophet's household. And please, if there are any comments, questions, observations, this is the time.
Nicolai.
Yes.
The written version of the paper makes it very clear that sort of axiomatic assumption of your whole train of thought is the idea of the heredity of prophecy. So had Muhammad had a son, then that son would become prophet after him. And you strongly suggest that that could be sort of gleaned from the Quran, but I think I might just want to put a question mark over that, and I'm actually not too sure that that arises from a reading of the Quran. So there's certainly, you know, Abraham wasn't born into a family with prophetic credentials. There's Noah and his sinning son. The son wasn't a prophet. So it doesn't seem that there's sort of this automatic idea that if a prophet has a son, the son will automatically advance to the office. I mean, it does seem that God has a word to say here, that there's some discretion. So if the automatic nexus doesn't hold, would that sort of endanger the foundations of your assumption?
Well, let me reformulate the question. If the
Microphone.
doesn't hold, does that maximize the foundations of my argument? But the Quran is very clear that beginning with Abraham, all subsequent prophets are min dhurriyyat Ibrahim. So it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Ishmael, and then prophecy goes in advance until Muhammad. Joseph. Oh yeah. Joseph, David, Solomon, Jesus. All of the, with the exception of the Arabian prophets mentioned in the Quran, all the prophets mentioned in the Quran, beginning with Abraham, are members of a single family, from which one can infer that prophecy passes from father to son. And even the three Arab prophets in the Quran, three Arabs who are mentioned, identified as prophets in the Quran, Hud, Salih, are given an Abrahamic genealogy by later Islamic tradition, I would argue, in order to qualify them as prophets. No, because Ishmael was a prophet, but none of Ishmael's descendants until Muhammad. Yeah, Ishmael was a prophet, but none of Ishmael's, so that was necessary, but Ishmael's sons were not prophets, and none of his sons, none of his descendants until Muhammad are prophets, and then suddenly the gene, what I call the gene for prophecy, reappears in Muhammad, miraculously. Yes. House of David, right. And the question with Jesus, well, who's Jesus? His mother, I mean, he's got, right, but Joseph wasn't his father, so it gets complicated. Right. Yeah. But, you know, and going back to Nicolai, is it my assumption that prophecy, back to Nicolai, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman clearly says, "Law baqiya Zaid lakana nabiy." Now, so how do you interpret that? At his time, someone must have argued that Zaid was a potential prophet, and he was responding to that argument. And I would say lots of people probably were making the argument, and that was part of the response to it. So I don't think I'm making up this idea that prophecy passes from father to son. I think Muslims were actively discussing that as late as the year 150 of the Hijrah.
Actually, just by talking now about the status of Jesus regarding Joseph, it's a little bit like Zaid and Muhammad, right?
Yeah.
So okay, that's one thing. The other thing that I got interested here is in this correspondence between Omar and Leo. Because this is around 99, and as far as I remember, the Buddhist archaeologists and not historian, I remember that Suleiman's in Abdul Malik's time was a little bit in this context of the end of the days, 99.
Yeah.
Not working. So perhaps there is here an atmosphere of who is the legitimate prophet achieving the end of the days?
Right. So there clearly at the end of the first Islamic century was an expectation of eschaton and finality, which was disappointed. But as for the correspondence between Omar and Leo, I'm on shaky, in certain respects, I'm on shaky ground there because we don't know if there was a true correspondence between those two men, although the historians who studied it suggest that even if it wasn't a true correspondence, it reflects ideas that were circulating during their time. But yes, and then thank you for Suleiman. So 99, I would suggest that most of the activity that we have access to was taking place between 685 and 750, beginning with Abd al-Malik and then Suleiman and Omar and others. But all the Muslim authorities who are giving us information, the earliest Muslim authorities who are giving us information about this episode flourished between the last quarter of the first century, in the last quarter of the first century, or in the second quarter of the second century, between 675, 725, something like that, when they would have been in contact with the Byzantines and there would have been mixing of the populations. That is to say, the point that I'm trying to make is, how many of you believe that God intervened in history 4 times in rapid succession in order to establish the doctrine that Muhammad was the last prophet? So you can leave, because I don't have anything to say to you. I really don't have anything to say to that argument. I just find it unacceptable as an historian. Okay? Theologically, it's fine. But as an historian, I don't think that's the way things happen. And so what I'm exploring is other ways of doing it, which take the problem out of the Jāhiliyya and put it into the mountain arena, in the 7th and the 600s and the 700s. Okay.
Are there any more questions, please? I see. This is provoking a lot of interest. Please. Go ahead.
So I have 2. Hopefully I'll be brief and direct. So one, we have thoughts on Madeline's idea that the Qur'an is explicit about Fatima being the inheritor of Prophet Muhammad, because he does have grandsons, right? And whether or not that's parallel with Mary, Jesus, the prophecy going through the matrilineal line. And the second one is the question of just how Christian our Christian sources are, and whether or not it's helpful to make that distinction. If you look at our earliest version of that Leo correspondence, which hopefully, by the way, there's going to be a new, complete edition of all the correspondence coming out. I think Tom Berman from Notre Dame is working on this project. I think it is exceedingly rich in terms of the details that it has about early Muslim religiosity and things like that. It has sectarian lists. It has you would only really expect to come from Arabic sources. And I think even John, some of this is there. So when John calls Zeid the comrade, that's actually a really great translation because it reminds me of like your fellow worker. In Greek, that's what it is. It's symponos. It's a fellow worker. And what that reminds me of, and this is definitely speculation on my part, is Mawla. Because John's father was himself a Mawla of the Umayyad Caliph. For him to be a Mawla meant to be a fellow worker of the Caliph. Right? I'm wondering what your thoughts would be on this.
Good. So as to the second point, absolutely, I'm creating an artificial barrier between the Christian and Islamic sources, and I'd like to break that barrier down and say that Muslims, non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others were all operating after the Arab conquest. We're all operating in a common cultural milieu, and ideas were going back and forth between them. That is very attractive. That idea is very, whether I can prove it or not, is very attractive to me. Fatima, yeah. So first, let me say something about Zeid. I think that Shi'i sources almost, not systematically, disregard Zeid. Or they have little or nothing to say about him. This is something I plan to look into in the future. Because he was a competitor. Actually, because his qualifications for leadership were greater than those of Ali or anybody else in the Muslim community. Muhammad's son, first Muslim, Hib Rasulullah, etc., etc., etc. And Usama, the sources report, the Prophet would put Hassan and Hussein on this leg, and he would put Usama on this leg, and he would put his arms around the three kids and say, "By God, I love all of them." That is, Usama's status was equal to that of Hassan and Hussein. And so Hassan and Hussein are descendants of Ali. So someone is suggesting that Usama bears important charismatic power. Even in the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, on his deathbed, when Muhammad's on his deathbed, Usama comes to the Prophet to visit him before he's sent off on a military mission, and he kneels down next to his bed. Raise your hand, put it on my head, please. And the Prophet puts his hand on his head. What does that mean? What does that mean? And the text says, Usama says, that's how I knew he was praying for him. But the image is of, an anointment. It's, Moses and all the other anointment images we have. So Usama was also a threat. And I think that the sources marginalized both Zeid and Usama in order to make way for Ali and or Umayyad people to take power and control. And interesting that Zeid's wife is identified in that early source as an Umayyad, not as a ambassador Hashimi. So that, why is that?
I think that there could be one more question, because anything more would be at the expense of the Meccan Qur'ān. We must treat all subjects equally. Al-Adl. So, last question,
Just a quick one. ما كان محمد أبا أحد. Most commentators and modern translators interpret this with the present. And of course, there are many examples. So I don't know whether you can emphasize this.
And I translated into the present until about a year ago when I just thought about it. But also, the verse supposedly was revealed, according to Islamic sources, in the year 5. So in the year 5, who can say that Muhammad is not the father of any of your men? Only God, or someone who's alive, who is alive after Muhammad died and could make that statement with confidence. It's looking back into the past. You can't. If you say in the year 5 Muhammad's not the father of any men, well, he could have a son in the year 6 and 7, and he did have Ibrahim, but he died. So I think that simple little grammatical point might be very important. And thank you for reminding and bringing that up. Yes. Thank you.